Part 1. There are basically two stages in the development of the Big Five. 1. The lexical hypothesis, and 2. Factor analysis. The lexical hypothesis was, for all intents and purposes, proposed in the late 1800s by Sir Francis Galton, who, quote, tried to gain an idea of the number of the more conspicuous aspects of the character by counting in an appropriate dictionary the words used to express them, unquote. Galton noted that, although there were many words for describing personality, each having, quote, a separate shade of meaning, yet each shares a large part of its meaning with some of the rest, unquote. In other words, although there are thousands of personality words in English, or in most any language for that matter, yet most of these words could be grouped together as synonyms for some 4 or 5 overarching personality concepts representing the personality-related wisdom of our ancestors who evolved our language over time. Fast forward to the 1930s. Thanks to Freud, psychology had exploded as an academic discipline and personality with it. The result was that, as John and Srivastava put it, quote, the number of personality traits and scales designed to measure them escalated without an end in sight into a babel of concepts and scales, unquote. Everybody had their own theory and definitions and flavor of doing things. This inspired researchers to find some kind of common ground between all the theories, a common language or taxonomy into which different systems could be translated. To this end, researchers Allport and Odbert in 1936 took their cue from Galton and scoured an unabridged English dictionary for personality-related words. They drew out about 18,000 of them. From this, they managed to distinguish 4 basic groupings. 1. Stable personality traits. 2. Temporary moods or states. 3. Morally charged judgments. And 4. Stuff that just doesn't fit into the other categories. But they didn't get any farther than that. Then, in 1940, Raymond Cattell took the first group, stable personality traits, of which there were about 4,000, and collapsed clear synonyms into each other. This gave him about 170 word concepts, 171 to be exact. From here, he constructed a test. He asked his subjects to rate their friends on each of the adjectives. It's a 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 scale, as I understand it anyway. Then he subjected the data to a statistical technique called factor analysis. Factor analysis identifies whether a given set of variables is better expressed by a smaller set of underlying variables. For instance, if you have, you can imagine it this way, if you have a tangled canopy of branches, factor analysis would tell you how each branch links up with a certain tree trunk, or at least what the most likely linkage is. Jordan Peterson succinctly describes this process. He says, quote, let's say I asked 100 questions of you and 100 other people. What I would find was, reliably, if some person answered question A, say on a scale of 1 to 7, if they answered it 6 or 7, there would be other questions in the set of questions which they also tended to answer on the upper end of the scale, or, reliably, if they answered one question at the top of the scale, they'd answer another question at the bottom. So it's a pattern of covariation. If I ask you 100 questions, how many questions am I really asking you? Because you might say, well, do you smile a lot? Are you happy? Do you wake up eager to start the day? You say, well, is that one question asked in 3 ways, or is it 3 separate questions? The answer is, if the answers reliably covary, then it's a reflection of an underlying single dimension, unquote. Cattell's factor analysis reduced the 171 adjectives down to 16 deeper underlying variables. Later on, these 16 variables were further analyzed down to just 5, quote, big factors. This was done by 2 researchers named Tupes and Christal in 1961. Quote, 5 fairly strong and recurrent factors emerged from each analysis, labeled as A, surgency, B, agreeableness, C. Dependability, D. Emotional stability, and E. Culture." Unquote. And then things went silent for about 15 years. Interest in the scientific study of personality dropped off. Apparently, people didn't place faith in science's ability to deal productively with personality. It wasn't until the 1980s that it became popular again, and has continued holding strong among personality researchers for about 4 decades. They have continued to refine it in numerous ways, and this has finally given us the ocean model as we now know it. And just so we're clear, surgency ended up becoming extroversion, agreeableness stayed the same, dependability became conscientiousness, emotional stability became neuroticism, and, emotional stability was changed into emotional instability, which was neuroticism, and culture was the basis for open-mindedness.